Finally got my grandparents' lamp. Yeah, baby. Hi, I'm Hobie1. This is Red Chair Reading. Tonight we're reading The Black Book of Secrets by F.E. Higgins. Chapter 24, Jeremiah Has a Plan. Let's go. Jeremiah Ratchet was close to his wits' end. He had just about enough of Joe Zabbidou's apparent disregard for his standing in the community. His business, his lifestyle, his pleasures were all in jeopardy because of that man. He could hardly bring himself to say Joe's name, and even then, he could only spit it, usually accompanied by a shower of brown, stringy saliva and crumbs. Jeremiah liked to mull things over at dinner. Jeremiah rarely ate in his magnificent dining room and usually took his meals in the study with a dinner tray on his lap. It was a room of generous proportions. Though badly lit and shelved from floor to ceiling, each shelf was packed tightly, bowing under the weight of an extensive array of books. Jeremiah was a collector. He loved to have things, sometimes for no other reason than that. He was not much of a reader, mind. He found the concentration required quite a strain on his head. Me too. As a rule, he only kept books that he thought would impress others or increase in price. As a result, the titles tended to be obscure and either full of facts that he didn't understand or plots that he couldn't fathom. Jeremiah was a fine example of the sort of person who knew the cost of everything, but the value of nothing. In his study, Jeremiah bit into a mouthful of lamb and chewed thoughtfully on Joe Zabbidou. The man was a complete menace. Earlier that day, Joe Bright had come up to Jeremiah outside the baker's and presented him with a purse of money that covered over half his debt. Then, after lunch, Polly told Jeremiah about the pair of horseshoes she had seen in the pawnbroker's window, and Jeremiah knew that once again Joe Zabbidou had been at work. "They're lovely and shiny," Polly had said innocently. "I should imagine Joe paid very good money for them." She left the room quickly, and Jeremiah was certain he heard her sniggering all the way to the kitchen. "I should have thrown them out that very first day," he said ruefully. "I left it too late." But even Jeremiah suspected that it would never have been that easy. Jeremiah realized, of course, that his tenant's sudden ability to pay was directly linked to the display in the pawnbroker's window. He reckoned, however, that Joe could not possibly finance everyone's debt, and that, sooner or later, he would be out of business, and then everything would be back to normal. But Joe did not operate within the usual constraints of commerce. Jeremiah shook his head slowly. How can a man thrive when he pays a small fortune for worthless junk? He asked himself that every day, and every day he waited for Polly to come back from the Reverend Sterling's so he could hear the latest report on the shop window. And every day it plunged him deeper into depression. How it had pained him to call upon Sterling for help when he had proved to be little better than useless. "What shall I do?" moaned Jeremiah as he saw his income dwindling further. For once, all the arrears were paid. He couldn't possibly survive on rent alone. He still had money in the bank, inherited from his father, but it had been greatly depleted over the years by his frequent gambling. Jeremiah's high living had a price. He owed money to his tailor and his hat maker, to his wig maker and his boot maker, and he preferred not to think of the debts that were mounting at the card table. There was blackmail, of course. Since he had unearthed Horatio's little secret, there had been no shortage of fresh meat in his kitchen, and until recently, he had been making good money from Obadiah and the grave robbing. Unfortunately, as far as grave robbing was concerned, things weren't looking too good at present, and not only Joe was to blame. Jeremiah's body snatchers, who also doubled up as bailiffs during the day when Jeremiah needed help with an eviction, had brought him the bad news a couple of nights ago. "The anatomists in the city don't want the old bodies no more," said one of the body snatchers. "They want fresh young ones." Jeremiah groaned. "Don't they understand? There aren't any young corpses in Pagus Parvis." "It doesn't have to be a problem," said the other man carefully. How do you mean?" asked Jeremiah. The wily pair exchanged knowing glances, which was not easy through their black face masks, and burst into throaty laughter. Well, let's just say there's a young lad up the hill in the old hat shop. Would make a nice specimen. Ludlow? Asked Jeremiah. But he's alive and kicking. The fresher the better, said the first. For a fleeting moment, Jeremiah actually considered just what they were suggesting. Many times he had wished never to have to meet Ludlow's knowing gaze again. But as a solution to his problems, out-and-out murder was a little extreme even for Jeremiah. No, no, said Jeremiah hurriedly. I'm sure that won't be necessary. There must be another way. What about teeth? Teeth? I heard you can sell them, began Jeremiah, but the two men just laughed. Oh, never mind, he ended despondently. The men shrugged in unison. Then there's nothing else we can do for you. Give us our money, and we'll trouble you no more. And that had been that. Jeremiah set aside his plate, the meal only half eaten, and slouched back into his chair. He had no appetite. He was too depressed to look at his books, not even The Loneliness of the High Mountain Shepherd, his all-time favorite, on account of the fact that the shepherds tended to have a limited vocabulary and to tell a simple story. If Joe stayed in the village and continued as he had done up until now, Jeremiah knew that it could only mean more trouble for him. He was going to have to take matters into his own hands. Pegasus Parvis is not big enough for the two of us, he declared to the shadows. One of us will have to go. Feeling very sorry for himself, he trudged upstairs and prepared for bed. He couldn't resist looking out of the window. By now it was an obsession. He could see the pawnbroker's shop at the top of the hill, and the smoke that curled out of the chimney every night into the early hours. What is he doing up there? He asked himself for the 100th time. Jeremiah was still no nearer to finding out why the pawnbroker received visitors well into the night, and he lacked the imagination to come up with an explanation on his own. He had heard someone say that Joe was giving advice, but he could discover no more. He asked Polly many times if she knew what it was all about, but she just looked at him blankly. Well, I wonder if Jeremiah is going to one day go up to the pawnbroker and tell his own secret, because I would like to know what that is. If only I could find out, thought Jeremiah, then perhaps I might be able to do something. But whatever nighttime trade was going on at the pawnbroker's, no one would talk about it. So Jeremiah drew his own conclusions and decided that it was all part of Joe's plot against him. Having concluded thus, he was even more desperate to know the truth. One morning, therefore, when the oldest sourdough dropped off the bread, Jeremiah was waiting for him outside the kitchen door and grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. I want you to do a little job for me, Ratchet muttered. Does it pay? Asked the boy. Jeremiah laughed. Ha, 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 ha. And the poor lad was treated to a panoramic view of the inside of his mouth. That mottled tongue, the fleshy uvula, those stained teeth, the meat and pie crust from the previous night still wedged firmly between them. I'll tell you what you'll get if you don't do it, he hissed. I'll tell your father that I found you sneaking around my kitchen looking for something to steal. Something like this. And with a sleight of hand that would have surprised even Joe, Jeremiah somehow managed to take a silver candlestick out of the boy's pocket, upon which trick the poor chap burst into tears. Jeremiah released his hold. Just do what I say, he growled, and you'll be no worse off. You must find out what's going on at the pawnbroker's. The lad hesitated, but the threat of his father was enough. He really had no choice. It took him a week, standing hour after hour in the freezing cold at midnight, around the back of the pawnbroker's shop, and every night it was the same. He heard the crunch of snow and the knock on the door. He watched as Joe handed his visitor a drink and sat him by the fire. In the corner he could see Ludlow writing furiously in a large black book. He could not hear what was being said, but he guessed quite quickly what was in the leather bags that Joe handed over at the end of the meeting. Eventually, he decided, he had learned as much as he was going to. He was also becoming increasingly afraid that Joe had seen him, and duly presented himself in Jeremiah's study. So, asked Jeremiah eagerly, what did you find out? They talk to Joe, and Ludlow writes down what they say in a big black book. And that's it? It wasn't at all what Jeremiah expected. The boy nodded. Whatever they're telling him, it's worth money. Joe pays them bags of it. Dr. Molderd was there the other night. I couldn't quite hear what he was saying, but his face looked as if it might be important. And I know my own father has been up there. So did Jeremiah. Elias Sourdoff had paid him nearly all his back rent. If this is interesting to you, please be sure to boop the like button. You'll help out the video to spread to other people. Thank you very much. So did Jeremiah. Elias Sourdoff had paid him nearly all his back rent. And what of the frog? Asked Jeremiah in desperation. He couldn't see how any of this was going to help him. She's called Saluki. Joe treats her like she's something special. He won't let anyone touch her, but sometimes she sits in his hand. I reckon she might be worth a few shillings. I've never seen anything like her. Jeremiah was perplexed. As he lay in bed that night thinking over what he had been told, it gradually dawned on him that, in fact, the Sourdoff boy had given him exactly what he needed to know. The book, he said out loud and sat bolt upright. The book holds the answer. Jeremiah's mind was racing. Whatever was in that book, Joe was prepared to pay handsomely for it. It made sense, then, that if Joe somehow lost the book, or perhaps it was taken from him, then he would also pay handsomely to retrieve it. Or better than that, perhaps he would agree to leave Pagus Parvis and pay up in order to get the book back. With Joe gone, all of Jeremiah's problems would be solved. Jeremiah's excitement mounted. What a fine revenge he could exact for all the trouble Joe had caused him. But there was one small flaw in the plan. How do I get the book in the first place, he wondered. But just before sunrise, he had the answer. The time had come for Jeremiah Ratchet to pay Joe Zabbidou a visit. That's the end of chapter 24. Thank you for joining me. I'll catch you again in chapter 25. Bye.